So good morning, everyone. My name is Robbie Bieber. I am struggling with the slides now. So I am a software engineer. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about career progression. So a lot of you have probably heard the acronym SDLC before, and it normally refers to the software development lifecycle, which is kind of the series of steps that a software project will go through from conception to completion. So I'm going to do kind of a super cheesy thing here and twist the acronym a little bit, talk about the software developer lifecycle. So the series of stages that your career as a software developer is likely to go through. And at each stage, I'm going to talk about the skills that you want to exercise to succeed at that level in your career, as well as the skills you should be developing to continue moving up to the next level. So we'll start where we all start, which is, at the level of kind of a beginner developer. Terms you may hear in the industry and in job listings are entry level, new grad. There's the ubiquitous term junior developer. And at this level, what is going to be expected? Right? So this is probably going to be your first job, maybe your first couple of jobs, straight out of school or boot camp or self-taught. So at this point in your career, your main qualification is going to be that you know how to program. That's kind of the beginning skill set, right? Other skills are nice to have, but at this beginner level, it's mostly about writing code. So the tasks that you're going to generally be given at this level in your career are going to be very well specified, kind of concrete tasks. An example of a task that might be delegated to a beginning developer would be something along the lines of go into the code for the user interface, add a button, which we have a mock of the design of here, and this should be the behavior when it's clicked. Or here's a bug report, we have a pretty good idea of where the problem is, go and fix that, right? So this is the point in your career where you're going to be exercising the least autonomy and focusing more on turning concepts into code. And it's easy to think of a career as a software developer is kind of a linear progression where you're just getting better and better and better at programming over time. But the reality is that most of the explosive growth in kind of coding ability is going to come here in the beginning stages. And as you move on through your career, the skills that are important are going to tend more away from strictly technical skills and into other skills that we'll get into later. But at this point, writing code is your main responsibility. You're also going to want to be very familiar with source control systems, such as Git or Mercurial, and ticketing systems like Jira that your company may use to manage tasks. So if you're not already familiar with source control in particular, when you start your first jobs at the beginning level, you should get familiar with it very quickly, because source control is kind of the bread and butter of a software developer's daily life when it comes to interacting with other members of your team. So what do you want to focus on to move on to the next stage in your career? Well, first and foremost, you're going to want to work on your communication with non-technical partners. So these could be people like an operations team that manages the services you work on. It could be sales teams who sell the work that you're doing. It could be even your customers directly, depending on the type of work you're doing and the size of your company. So your job as you advance in your career ends up revolving more and more around being able to not only do technical work, but to explain technical work to people who are not themselves programmers. You should also start to understand the architecture of the systems you're working on at a smaller scale. So you need to expand the scope of your consideration from just the specific little bit of code that you're working on at any given time out to the system that it's a part of and the components around it that it interacts with. And you should also be starting to get involved in code review, even very early in your career. So it can be intimidating when you're brand new to be reviewing the code of people who are many years your senior. But the reality is that even the best developers, even the most experienced developers, make simple mistakes sometimes. And even the absolute newest beginner can catch those mistakes. So you want to start getting involved in code review before it becomes a core part of your job. Even if you don't feel comfortable making accept or reject decisions on pull requests right away, you should at least be jumping in, asking questions about things that don't make sense to you, and calling out details that could potentially be mistakes. And as you begin to move on from here, we get into kind of more of an intermediate, or what you'll often see called a mid-level developer role. Okay? And at this point in your career, the expectations are going to start to shift a little bit away from the technical. On the technical front, though, you're going to be given less specific tasks. You might even get little sub-projects as parts of bigger projects, or even small projects on their own. So at this point in your career, you're going to be expected to start really exercising some autonomy. You're going to be able to take a larger, less well-defined task, something like, for instance, build the user interface component of this larger project, right? And while you're going to still potentially have guidance from other developers and designers and product managers and other people on the projects, you're going to find yourself having to make a lot of technical decisions and potentially even some product decisions. At this stage, you're also going to be expected to be fluent in your interactions with the non-technical partners that you work with. This means you should be able to do things like explaining to people who are not programmers why a project is ahead of or behind schedule, whether a given feature request is feasible to implement, how long a feature request might take to implement if you were to prioritize it. You should be able to do things like explaining the behavior of a system to people who can't read its source code. This is going to become a core part of your job. You should also be contributing to code review on a regular basis at this point. You should be able to look at a pull request or a diff or whatever your source control system calls a request to make a change, and you should be able to look at it, spot mistakes, call them out, and request changes, or sign off on the change if it looks good to you. You should also be starting to mentor the newer people on your team. And it may feel at this point in your career like you're not ready to be a mentor because you're barely out of that beginning stage yourself. But if you know something, you can teach something. And in fact, I often find that it's more useful to learn something from someone who learned it very recently than from someone who's known it for a long time and may have kind of forgotten what it's like to be a beginner. Now, the things you're going to want to focus on to kind of move up from here are, first of all, defensive coding and testing, right? So at this stage in your career, you should be writing tests, but you may be writing tests as something that you're told to do, right? So a big part of the difference that I see between kind of an intermediate level developer and the senior developers is the senior developers have this sense that I like to call seriousness about them, right? So they take things like tests seriously. They're not just writing tests because they're told to. They're writing tests because they understand the value of a test, right? And they're coding defensively. They're not just writing code that works in the moment. They're writing code in such a way that they will know if it breaks, right? And not because someone has told them to, but because they care about not just getting the code working, but keeping it working. In the same vein, you should be starting to think about the observability and the reliability of the systems you're building. This is another one of those kind of aspects of seriousness. You're not just trying to get something out into the world. You're trying to get something out into the world that's going to keep running for as long as it needs to run. And you're not just building in metrics and logging because, say, the data analyst asked for it. You're building those in because you genuinely care about knowing what's going on with your code. You want to know if your service is running or if there's something wrong with it. You should also be starting to comprehend architecture at a larger scale. So you want to expand the scope of your consideration even further to where you're considering not just the individual bit of code, not just the larger, slightly larger components, but also the system as a whole and how those small and medium-sized components fit into it. So moving on from there, we get into this kind of more experienced role, what's frequently called a senior developer in job listings. And at this point, your expectations are growing, right? You should now be taking responsibility for potentially large-scale projects, right? You should be capable of taking a request to build a system from scratch and take responsibility for bringing that project from the very beginning of its life cycle all the way to completion. You should be architecting a system. You should be able to break it up into pieces. And this doesn't necessarily mean that you're coding it all yourself, because another important skill is learning to delegate, right? You should be able to take the project that needs to be done, the set of other developers who are working with you. You should be able to break that project up into pieces and assign some of that work to other developers whose skill set and whose kind of level of experience matches that work. You should also be taking a very serious role in mentoring the less experienced developers on your team, right? So at this point in your career, you should be a prime candidate for, if your company has a concept of like an onboarding mentor or like a spin-up buddy, we call it at my company, right? Where your job is basically to kind of help someone start at the company for their first couple of weeks, right? Like this is a stage in your career where you should be very actively volunteering for that kind of role. You should also be beginning to collaborate with other teams at the company. A buzzword you'll hear a lot at tech companies is cross-functional, which basically means at this point in your career, they want you to be not just influencing the work of your own team, but also to be aware of and collaborating with members of other teams. So if you have a project that your team is considering, you should be aware if another team that's adjacent to your team is also starting up or preparing to start on a project that may have some overlap with it or could potentially collide in some awkward ways. And you should be giving them a heads up what's coming down the pipeline so they're not awkwardly surprised, right? You just need to expand the scope of what you're working on from your own team's responsibilities to a broader level. Now, if you want to level up from this stage in your career, which is not something that everyone will do, that's not something that you have to do. Most tech companies I've found consider this level to be like a terminal or a career level, which basically means that they're okay if you just want to stay here for the rest of your career. But if you want to continue to move on to kind of the lofty heights of individual contributor roles, the first thing is you have to live and breathe best standards. Moving up from here, it should just be a given that if you're writing code, it's going to be of exceptional quality. And you should be influencing those best practices at the entire company level, right? You shouldn't just be writing good code, you should be encouraging everyone else to write good code. And you should be working on kind of really big foundational projects. And that's the kind of thing that gets you into these sort of lofty, rarefied heights of what you might hear called a staff or a principal, engineer, or developer role. So at this stage in your career, you're going to be taking responsibility for not just significant projects, but for deeply influential and kind of projects that have impact at the company level, right? So something that I've had given to me as an example of the type of project that an engineer at this level does is at a previous job, we had a group of, I think, 2 or 3 people just kind of decide on a whim to try building a new programming language interpreter. And they did it. It ended up being deployed to production for all of the company's code, and it sped things up a lot. It saved a couple tens of millions of dollars of hardware costs every year. And that's the kind of thing that these very high-level individual contributors do. They spot opportunities, right? No one told them to build that. And they build these just immensely impactful projects. At this level in your career, you would also be influencing the best practices of the entire company, as well as making technical decisions, right? So you shouldn't just be writing code to your company's style guide. You should be consulted on the style guide. You shouldn't just be making decisions about which technologies to use for your projects. You should be one of the people who gets called up to consult on when the company is making decisions about which technologies should be endorsed for all new projects. And you should be involved in mentorship at a very large scale, right? So at this stage in your career, you should be not just mentoring the other people on your team, you should be doing things like working on the curriculum for your company's onboarding, right? In setting up mentorship programs, potentially getting involved in hiring practices, right? This is a level in your career where you should be responsible for raising the level of technical talent of everyone around you, not just on your own team, but in the entire engineering organization that you work in. And so that is, very briefly, my somewhat condensed view of, a rough approximation of software developer job roles. So thank you all very much for watching. I hope this was somewhat useful, especially to some of you who may be starting your own careers. And thanks again to the Suncoast Developers Guild for having me. It's always a great time. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you, Robbie. We got some time, I think, to do answer any questions. I will say that when you started to tell the story about somebody taking it upon themselves to write their own programming language, I didn't expect it to go in the direction of saving the company millions of dollars.
It usually doesn't.
I wouldn't have thought so.
When you're exceptional, it does.
Yeah, that's pretty great. Let's see. Any questions or anything from anybody? Okay. Well, I think we might have a no-show for our second speaker. Oh, we got a question from, I clicked away. Ben would like to know, when do you stop feeling like a poop developer?
I think when you switch to management, right?
Yeah, when you stop being a developer.
Yeah, it never really happens.
No. Yeah, that's the imposter syndrome, right? The further you get, the Dunning-Kruger curve, right? When you're far down the line.
Yeah.
We have.
For most of y'all, it's imposter syndrome. For
Yeah.
me, I'm just writing really bad code, but everyone else, it's imposter syndrome.
Right. That's how it works. Let's see. Catherine says, "What are some tips you'd give for newly minted developers?"
Yeah. So I kind of mentioned how like your non-technical skills are going to become more important as you kind of progress up through the levels. Start focusing on those right away. I feel like kind of non-technical people always enjoy it a lot when a new developer like starts taking an interest in what they're working on, like makes a serious effort to do communication well. Like that's something they usually expect to struggle with. So if you can start working on kind of your communication, your translation of technical concepts right out the box, it will make you a favorite with a lot of the partners that your team depends on.
Great. Any other questions? Didn't seem like it. All right. Well, thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. I am going to knock you off the stage and bring in our next speaker.
All right.